Hello and welcome to part 2 of my SharePoint Saturday 2019 presentation, AngularJS and SharePoint. Of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, it's actually part 4. So I know that's a little bit confusing. I had 2 one-hour presentations to give at SharePoint Saturday, and I'm breaking it up for YouTube. So this is actually part 4 if you're watching it on YouTube. But anyway, this is the second hour of my presentation, and I'm actually a little ahead of schedule, so that means I've got plenty of time to answer questions when I give the presentation on Saturday. This has been very helpful doing the YouTube videos before I give the talk because it helps me time how long each segment takes, and if one segment is taking too long, I need to recut it. But it gives me a good idea of how to pace myself and make sure I don't spend too long in any one topic. But I have so much to cover, it's really hard to get it in within 2 hours and not feel like I'm rushing or I'm skimming over something, because this is a fairly complex thing to do. But the main thing to remember, the entire purpose of this presentation, it represents months of work I spent looking at different YouTube videos, reading different articles online, and piecing together all of the different components of getting SharePoint to talk to Angular. And in this series, which is a year after I did my first one, I've learned so much more about working with specific SharePoint fields that I can add more information. So it's based on my own knowledge over the last 2 years. But the whole point of this video series is, if you watch all of them, or if you attended the SharePoint Saturday session, you will know how to go home, download the zip file I created, and make your own application that's tied to a SharePoint list and build it all in Angular using nothing but SharePoint Designer and your browser. So that's what's really cool. And that's the whole point of this, is to get you started working with Angular and SharePoint. So let's get into the presentation. So just as a review, we are going to be showing you how to build a single-page application in AngularJS. Our application will read a SharePoint list, show different views, search and filter. You'll be able to read, add, edit, and delete a SharePoint item. And what do we need? We need to download the JavaScript libraries for jQuery and Angular, and those are included in the zip file, and they're all going to be in the same folder. Remember that. They all go in the same folder inside Assets. Once you're comfortable with it, I recommend moving all the supporting files over to like the scripts library so you can build multiple applications and then point to the same place for common files. But to get you up and running so you won't be confused, I stick them all in the same library folder. We need to create a SharePoint list, which I've already created. IT requests, we've already seen that. We need to create a site page, which is spsdemo.aspx, of course, SharePoint Saturday demo, if people didn't catch that. And then we put a content editor web part on there, and then we pointed that to our requests.html, which is our home page for our application. And of course, we need to create our HTML, CSS, and JS files, which I reviewed at the end of the last video. And in this video, we're going to go dive into the actual code, and you're going to see each of the different components and what makes up the application. Again, just as a review, these are the 7 HTML and JS files. I didn't list the CSS file. You can look at it in the zip, but it's really not worth digging into. Basically, requests.html is our home page. That is where we launch the application, and it is the parent. It holds the child files. Requests.js is where we define our module, and we put all of the code that is not a controller. List, display, and edit are the child HTML files. They are what the list view displays, what the display view, what controls it, displays, and then the edit and new view is in the edit. I hadn't mentioned this before, but I use both edit for edit and new transactions because I found that the new form, the edit form, have exactly the same controls, and I just need to put in a variable that tells me this is new, and I'm going to hide things for a new form. But it didn't make sense to make a separate HTML just for new that had everything in the edit we'll just simply use one and then hide stuff depending on the state of your transaction. Then we have the two other JS files, request.list and request.item. Those each hold the list controller and the item controller. And yes, I will be explaining what a controller is when we get to those pages. And like I said in the previous video, you could put all of your JS files in one bucket. You could just have one JS file with all of your JavaScript code if you chose to. But to me, it makes more sense to break them out by component so you know when you're editing them what you're working with. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first file. Here is our requests.html file. This is the home page for the entire application. And as I mentioned, we have our JavaScript libraries are all referenced here, as well as specifically these are the three JS files used by our application: requests, request list, and requests item. Then we have the style sheet. Notice that the UI grid CSS is needed. That is for using the UI grid, and as I mentioned in the very first video, there are several UI grid CSS files that are required in order for the grid to work. And you need to have them all present, but we've already figured out how to make them work with the grid. You don't need to really monkey with them, but in the actual CSS file, you will find there are places where you can edit the height of your grids and so forth. So the main thing I want to show is the actual meat of this page, and surprisingly, there's not that much to it. This is it, okay? There's an H1 tag, and there's two div tags, okay? So the H1 tag is going to appear before our application. So on every page, you're going to see the H1 tag. The outside div has an attribute here, mod requests. If you're using Angular, you need to tell your browser that you're using Angular. And you do that by the ng app attribute. Now, everything in Angular starts with ng. If it's Angular specific, it's ng-something. A module is the main component. It's the project. It's the container that all of your code sits in. So if I had two modules here, for some reason, I would have two div tags, and each one would have their own ng app attribute defining which module owned that container. I don't see at this point a valid reason to have multiple modules in the same application. It's just easier for you to define one module and all of your controllers and everything live within it. I would say that at the point in your career when you figure out that you need to use multiple modules in Angular because you've defined a need, then you won't need me to explain to you why. So just to keep things simple, one application, one module for your entire application. I also want to point out that this is inside of a div tag. You can put Angular in the HTML tag, in the body tag, in a div, in a span, in a TD. You can put it in any HTML container object. I like divs because divs are very straightforward. There's not a lot of overhead. I just simply define a div, put the ng app attribute in, and I'm ready to go. That's all I need to think about it. But they actually can go inside of any container. So the more you mess around with Angular, it's something that you'll want to maybe experiment with and learn more about. But for now, just use a simple div. Now, inside of that div, if I was, say, wanted to have something that was dependent on using a variable in my application, say a header or links that changed based on actual attributes of the application, I would put it just inside the first div. My H1 doesn't need to rely on anything, so it's outside of the application. Likewise, if I wanted to have some code at the bottom of my application on every page, I would put it here below the application div. Now inside that div, of course, is another div called ngView. That's all you put in, the attribute ngView. That there is the container that your browser is going to use when you tell the router, I want to load this child page, I want to load that child page. ngView is where that ends up. So it looks very simple here, and it is. You've got two divs. One has the ng-app attribute. The inside one has the ngView attribute, and that's all you need to make your router work. That's all there is to the requests.html page. Here is our requests.js file. You notice right at the top we have defined our Angular module mod requests. I just want to say a note about Hungarian notation. I use it sparingly to make sure I don't confuse my controllers with my modules. I always preface my module name with MOD, but then I pretty much use just regular variable names for all of my code. But you'll see I'll occasionally use Hungarian notation. I also want to make note of the modules that we are importing or injecting into our module. They're defined with double quotes. Just follow that standard when you need to add additional modules. Basically, in order for route to work, we have to import ng-route. And that brings us to our router. Simplest way to explain it is, here's a when. It's basically a switch where you have different when statements. Just follow it. Add your own pages as you see fit until you understand it. But I'm not going to dig deep into all of the syntax. I do want to mention the web absolute URL. That's a local variable I'm defining. This SP variable gives me the web absolute URL. Basically, it's the address, the web URL for the current SharePoint site that you're in, or sub-site. So we use that a lot, and that saves us typing it. That way, wherever you put this code, you don't have to rewire the URL. You can take this out of one site and put it in another site, and it will still work because it's going to find the web absolute URL. There's also a site absolute URL that I don't need to use in this example, in this application, but site absolute URL is the same basic context. Okay, so here we have search, we have display, we have edit, and further down we have new. In fact, let's scroll down just a little bit so you can see. Okay. At the bottom, you can see the otherwise. Basically, it throws a warning if we don't identify one of these. You see that based on what we enter here, we are either going to call up list, display, or edit for our choices. Okay, so we've named an HTML file. We're naming a controller and a name and a controller alias. As you see, the first one is list. All the other ones are item. So I'm saying use this controller with this HTML file. Note that edit and new both use item. They both use edit, and they both use the item controller. Display uses the item controller. There really is no advantage to separating the code between display, edit, and new. I just use one item controller because 90% of the code applies to all three states. But you will note that we have edit and new as variables. You can just simply add your own variable, any name you want, as long as it's not a reserved word that like controller or controller as. So you can just add your own variables, and they will be available as parameters inside of your code. So unlike a query string where it's really hard to tease it out and define a specific value, when you're using fragment identifiers, name the variables you want to use inside your routing, and then when you're in the controller, those source parameters are just available. It's very convenient. All right, and one other thing I want to point out is the syntax for how our fragment identifier works. You remember we had display when we were looking at the display version. Display is, that word has to appear, and the slashes distinguish between variables. Edit must appear. New must appear. And those are hardwired words. It must be that exact word. Then we have colon item ID. Well, a colon means it's a variable. There must be a variable. So 4 or 5, whatever our item ID is. And item ID is also a parameter that's available inside your controller. So once you're in your controller, you're going to point to this item ID, and there you have it, and you know which item you're using. It's very convenient. Next, we have search, which is also a colon, but there's a question mark at the end, which means it's optional. So our search criteria is passed from one state to another. We bring it in as a source parameter, and then when we build the URL to go to the next page, we pass it back in. So colon is a variable, no colon is an explicit word, and a question mark after a colon is an optional variable. So moving on down here, we get to our date picker. Directives are an important element of AngularJS. So when you're compiling a list of things my instructor didn't cover in this course, put directives on that list. On your own, I suggest you go and learn something about directives. They are very powerful. They can do a lot. I've only found a few reasons to use them so far, but I know there's a lot of potential in them. This directive gives me a date picker, as is, just like this, with some CSS you'll find in requests.css to make the background a little bit nicer. But the date picker, all I do is when I'm naming a text box for my date, I put the attribute date picker, and it shows up as a calendar. It's very, very cool. Okay, now we're going to get into our factory. There are 3 things in Angular that are all related to each other, to inherit from the other. They are called service, provider, and factory. Service, provider, and factory. One of the links I'm going to give at the end of this video is a YouTube video that explains the difference between a service, a provider, and a factory. I recommend you understand them. They all do basically the same thing. They store values and make them available to any controller. See, my 2 controllers, list and item, every time you load a page, when you go from display to edit or back to display or to new or to display, you're reloading that item controller, you are reloading that child page, you are resetting all of your variables. So other than the parameters being passed in from the router, you're starting over. So I have to reload the item on every page. Well, that's not too bad. It's just one item. But I want to store the SharePoint list of request categories, request departments, request technicians. I don't want to keep loading those every time I load a page. That's taking up a lot of overhead. These are small lists and they'll go really fast. But let's say you have 10,000 records in some lookup list and you want to pull that data and make it available in your application. You don't want to keep loading it over and over and over again. So we turn to a factory. So like I said, we have service, provider, and factories. They all have their own uses. As you play with them, you will learn which one to use in which situation. In this particular case, because it's fairly complex, we need to use a factory. But basically, a factory is like a static class that has methods available to other classes. But in our case, we're actually storing values in it that persist across your session. So when we load the categories once, it's going to be available every time a new controller wants to pull it up. So we have our definition. Its name is data, and we're going to refer to it as data in the calling programs. And you notice we have a similar module injection here, I'm going to be pulling Q and HTTP because I'm using Q and HTTP in my code. If I don't reference it, this is where your number one place you make mistakes, is you didn't define the module and you referenced it within a class. So notice that the first time I reference them, it's inside of these square brackets and it's double quotes. And then I have the function and I name it again inside the function as an argument, and there are no quotes. So here is my data variable in AngularJS, probably in JavaScript in general. Double curly brackets, or curly brackets, are the definition of an object. So I'm defining a data object. The neat thing about JavaScript is when you define an object, it's very easy to hang additional collections and properties onto that object. You just tack them on whenever you need to. Here's our web absolute URL we're getting again. And here is our get categories function. But first, I want to take a second and scroll down to the bottom of my factory. So here we have return. This right here is how we share the functions inside of our factory with our controllers outside the factory that are calling it. It has to be wrapped in a return. And you notice we have get categories. This is the external name. If I'm calling this function from that controller, I'm going to say data.getCategories. This is the internal function that returns its value to this function. Now, the syntax looks a little strange here, but trust me, it's easier just to leave it like this and name them the same. If you really want to get technical, you could call this inner get categories, inner get choices, or whatever, but really it's not worth it. If I'm calling get categories, I know I'm using get categories inside of my factory. Okay, so here let's go up and take a look at get categories again. I'm defining my function. Now, when I first come in here, data categories is going to be null because I just defined data here. Data categories is going to be null. So it's going to come here, it's going to define categories as a collection. Square brackets defines a collection, and you need to push items onto your collection. This is an HTTP call. This is an asynchronous call. Here's our web URL. Here's our REST API that we talked about in the earlier video about calling a SharePoint REST API. I'm calling request categories, and I'm taking the results. You need to understand about promises. I may talk about that later, but basically, this is an asynchronous call that returns a promise. The then is the result of the promise, and the response is the output from the promise. You call a promise and you say, when you're done, come back and I'll do something with the results. That's how asynchronous processes are handled. Basically, as you come through here, you're going to call HTTP. It's going to do an asynchronous call and immediately drop down to here and keep going in your code. So that's how promises are handled. Later, once the promise is resolved, the then fires. If the call was successful, then fires. If it fails, then a catch would be called. We put our catch in the calling program so the errors are handled correctly. All right, so here's our results. We are making a new item called category, and I'm assigning the result to the ID property, the title property, to our local variable category, and I'm pushing it into data categories, and then I'm going to return data categories. This is going to return a promise to the calling program. Now you might ask, why didn't I just use result and just return results? because when you make a SharePoint REST call, you're getting a whole lot of clutter, a whole lot of overhead that you really don't need. So it's simpler just to make a collection, loop through all of the results of your call, and just populate the properties you need into a new collection and pass that back to the calling program. Also, this Angular for each is how a for each works in Angular. Results is our collection. Result is each item within that collection. So you notice we got result, result. Okay, that's a very quick and dirty explanation of this. Now we're going to go back up here. This is the second time through. We've already defined data categories, so it does have a value. I don't need to go and call HTTP, call REST, and get the data again. I've already got it. So I'm going to return my existing value data categories using another asynchronous call, QN. QN is a very useful function that allows you to create a promise, because there are times when in your code you need to return a promise to the calling program, but you're not actually executing an asynchronous call. You just got to say, I want this to look like a promise, and that's what QN does for us. So again, if data categories exists, I'm just going to return it so I don't have to call up the SharePoint list request categories more than once in a session. Okay, that's it for the requests.js file. All right, that was a very long session there talking about requests.js, but there are a lot of concepts I needed to cover, and unfortunately, sometimes the best way to explain them is to actually walk through them as you see them. A promise is a very important thing, and you need to understand it and how it makes asynchronous calls work. I'll probably talk about it more when I get into the item.js file. But that's it for part 4 of the video series and the first part of part 2 of my SharePoint Saturday presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you in part 5.